Meghan Markle's podcast is a disaster. Shocker, I know. From the overly produced sound design to the repetitive themes, it's clear the Meg is missing the mark with the listeners. Let's dissect why her podcast is failing to connect and where she's gone wrong, as well as the public image consequences of another failed venture. So this podcast, Confessions of a Sucky Business Lady, was supposed to focus on female entrepreneurs. It aimed to highlight the stories of women who had built successful businesses and overcome adversity. But unfortunately, most of the guests were people who had a lot of privilege and or help in getting to where they are. The guest list was not full of women who launched from nothing. Most of them had wealthy husbands or family to help, or at the very least, an elite education. And you cannot deny the connections and the steps up and help that those sorts of things have, and the impact that they have on somebody's ability to successfully bring a business to life. The podcast claimed that it was going to feature intimate conversation, with Meghan creating a comfortable space for her guests to share personal stories and insights. But intimate, I feel like, is a stretch. It felt very superficial and surface level. A lot of these people, of course, didn't know Meghan very well. And also, coming onto a podcast that's going to be business focused, you're not coming on there to talk about personal stuff and be intimate. So it was probably a little bit confusing, maybe even jarring, for the guests to be getting a different type of line of questions and into a different type of conversation than what they maybe expected. The podcast was meant to explore the highs and lows of building a business, focusing on the lessons learned and the laser focus required for success of an entrepreneurial journey. But this often came in the form of platitudes. Things like, I wish I had stopped to enjoy more, or I wish I hadn't worked so hard. Nothing particularly exciting and nothing particularly valuable either. Meghan also claimed that it was meant to coincide with an application to her own brand, that she was going to apply the lessons she learned from her guests to the launch and growth of As Ever, but we haven't really seen that. This really didn't come through. There was no guidance that she then went and changed anything in her business or was like, oh my gosh, light bulb moment, I need to go and fix this. So we can't really find any evidence of this actually happening. So even though Meghan is trying to market this podcast this way, as, oh, this is going to be, me seeing lessons that I can apply to my business and you'll get to see that happen and unfold, it didn't. It never transpired. False advertising. The podcast's goals were to inspire listeners, provide valuable insights, and highlight authentic voices, okay? The podcast aimed to inspire aspiring entrepreneurs and those interested in learning more about the female entrepreneurial landscape. But you really didn't feel inspired listening to it. It was incredibly boring, and especially when you take into account how wealthy these women are, and Meghan, not even on her own merit, just making a hobby into a business with all the money at her disposal to make it happen and make it easy on herself, and all the staff that she needs, having nannies, things like that. It's not really inspiring to hear somebody who has it super duper easy and is just doing it almost like they're doing it for fun. That's not inspiring. No. Because that's not what most entrepreneurs are facing. They're facing a totally different set of challenges and circumstances. So that might even be off-putting. I don't want to hear from somebody who's dealing with things from a point of ease and effortlessness. I want to hear from somebody who's really in the grit of this and dealing with it the same way I am. The podcast claims it advertises itself to offer insights into the challenges and rewards of building a business, including overcoming setbacks and trusting instincts. But I feel like these insights are very rare and they're very broad. They're just like umbrella things. There's nothing really specific and no real opportunity for somebody who is actually trying to be an entrepreneur to listen to this and get real value that they could apply. There really actually isn't. So this whole thing feels very much like false advertising. They thought this was going to be this, but what they got was something different entirely. The podcast claims to feature candid conversations with female founders, allowing listeners to hear their unfiltered stories, but the authenticity felt grossly lacking. It sounded very filtered, it sounded very scripted, and very controlled. like with most things Meghan does. And this was likely due to those high narcissistic traits. It's the way in which Meghan speaks and conversates that often sounds odd, peculiar, and condescending. And I think it contributes to her inability to have a stimulating conversation with nice flow and a good pace, because she takes herself far too seriously, and at the same time doesn't take her opportunities serious enough to look at objectively or practice or plan properly. The podcast has faced a lot of criticism for being really shallow, too self-focused, and lacking depth. Critics argue that it primarily serves as a platform for Markle to discuss her own experiences and opinions rather than providing insightful interviews or exploring the challenges faced by female founders. Some also accuse it of being overly flattering and lacking genuine business advice because it's a lot of just butt kissing, Nobody needs to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that. It does feel very shallow and self-indulgent, and the general consensus is that's the main synopsis of this podcast. That's the true summary, is that it's self-indulgent, it's shallow, and it's more so just a vanity project for Meghan. Critics have described the podcast as a stomach-turning display of self-indulgence and a Montecito ego trip. They argue that Meghan focuses too much on her personal experiences and doesn't delve into the complexities of the issues she addresses, which I would agree with, and is exactly why this does not match the intention of the podcast at all. The lack of depth and authenticity is a chief complaint. Some reviewers contend that the conversations lack depth and authenticity, with Meghan failing to ask challenging questions and redirecting the conversation towards herself. Big surprise. She does that with every single project. It's also been criticized for being overly complimentary of its guests, with some viewers labeling it sycophantic. This is seen as detracting from the potential for a more insightful and honest discussion, and one that's more focused on business. And this is the problem. Because Meghan doesn't actually know what she's doing in the business world, she doesn't know how to have a podcast about a business. Duh. So it just ended up being another one of her vain projects that's just vacuous and empty. Critics also argue that it doesn't offer any practical business advice or insights into the realities of running a company. It's seen more of a girl talk session between friends than a resource for aspiring female founders, but yet they packaged it and marketed it as more of a serious business thing. And I think the real reason why they did that was because they would have less competition on a business podcast than, like, say, a celebrity podcast. They would never beat out popular podcasts. They just wouldn't. Meghan doesn't have enough charisma for that. It's not entertaining enough. But they could maybe beat out some of the more dry business podcasts. So I think that's a big reason why they tried to market this as a serious business podcast rather than just chatting. Some critics suggest that the Meg is too out of touch with the struggles and realities of the entrepreneurial experience, particularly for women, given her privilege, her resources, etc., the fact that this is really just a hobby situation, and that she has no experience, meaning she's only been doing these things for like a year, little more than a year maybe. She doesn't have enough years under her belt to be giving any sort of insight into this stuff because she's still in the very early learning stages, and her business might flop. It might be gone in a year. We don't know. Some reviewers have described it as having an inane stream of mindless aphorisms and argue that the content is superficial and lacks substance, and see the podcast as perpetuating the girl boss archetype, which is seen as problematic and outdated approach to female entrepreneurship. And the numbers show this, that it doesn't line up with its summary and the way it was marketed, and it's not delivering any value, and it's just kind of pointless and dumb. The podcast, thus, has not performed in any sort of impressive way. It did receive mixed reviews, with some critics finding it shallow and not offering insights, and so it did not achieve the same sustained success as Archetypes did, but Archetypes also flopped, so the bar was already low, and this one came in even lower. The podcast's rankings declined, reportedly dropping out of Spotify's top 100 in the US and the UK, and not appearing on Apple's top 200 chart by episode 3. While there are some opinions that are positive, most people view it as uninformative and not worth the listen. As of right now, there are no plans to do more episodes or renew any deal with Meghan yet. So it would seem that this podcast might be yet another one-off for her. I really think she needs to step away from podcasting altogether. Just stop. She's not a good voice talent, as the Spotify executive said that she is not a good voice talent. She just isn't. And she's a grifter. So I think they need to step away from the podcast space altogether. She can focus on Netflix, she can focus on As Ever, and because there will be less on her plate, she might actually do a little bit better at it and perform a little bit better at it. Because when you have too much going at once, there's no possible way to keep up juggling all of it. But leave your thoughts on the podcast in the comments. Thank you for joining me for today's video. I hope you have a happy day ahead, and I'll see you next time. Bye!